So now with Father's Day, I'm sure it's going to be an unusual deal. You know, you guys aren't going to have to cook and, today so it'll be a little bit different. So we'll get started. Look over in Genesis 37. Thanks, Greg. Genesis 37. Now, what we did last week, we kind of brought up the idea that the theme of the Bible is Genesis 3:15. That talks about there's going to be enmity between Jesus, basically is what it's talking about, and Satan, and how Jesus is going to win. And then you have the outline of the Bible based on Genesis 12, 1 and 2, where it talks about the Abraham's given a promise of he's going to have a land, he's going to be a nation, he's going to have a blessing. And so we talked about that blessing is all the way down. It goes from Abraham, then it goes to Isaac, and then it goes to Jacob. And that's where we left. We talked about a lot of other stuff before there, in between there, but that's kind of the main aspect of it. So looking at chapter 37, what we're going to see, and I kind of mentioned this last week, is you're going to see God looking for someone to partner with. He's looking for someone to use. And you see that all the way through. He uses people. And so he's going to use Abraham. And then he's going to use Isaac. Then he's going to use Jacob. And from there, it's just going to keep on going. So we're going to see, this is one of the stories that I know you're going to be familiar with, but we're going to go through it because I think it's really important. Because when you look at it, and we're in Genesis 37, because when you look at it, there's some people that are minor characters that end up doing amazing things. And this is a person who has several chapters that talks about him, but he's not in the lineage of Jesus. But what he does is he keeps that promise going because God is using him. So in 37, we're talking about one of the sons of Jacob. We're talking about one of the sons of Israel. He has 12 of them, and we're going to be talking specifically about Joseph. When you're a little kid in Bible class, you hear about Joseph all the time. And so this is, how does he connect with this? Why is this story even there? Well, the story is there because we've got to get to Jesus. We've got to get to that promise. And so in Genesis 37, we see there's some things that just going to cause some issues in a family. And verse 1 would be probably the first cause of that. And so if you're picking one kid over another and you're showing favorites, that's going to aggravate them, right? So they saw that their father loved Joseph more than the rest of them, so they're pretty aggravated. We've had to take my sister to counseling because my parents love me more than her. And and I'll never send this to her because she'll be like, "What? What are you telling those folks?" But you shouldn't be able to tell the difference. Your parent, you shouldn't be able to tell if your parents appreciate you more or your sibling more. It should be the same. But in this case, it wasn't. And so it gets even worse as we know the story. In verse 7, he tells of a dream. He talks about how all these sheaves are going to be bowing down to him. And then he tells of the next dream. And he's so naive of a kid, he doesn't realize this is upsetting him. And in verse 9, he tells him, he says, he said, the moon, the sun, the 11 stars, they were all bowing down to me. And so they're just getting, this kid's full of himself. So as they're off doing their thing and he's kind of younger, there in Genesis 37, he's told to go track him down. So he does. And when he's there, verse 21 says that Reuben, he decides, because everybody's wanting to kill him. He says, no, let's not do that. And so they decide not to do that. Instead, in verse 25, they see this caravan of Ishmaelites. Now, where do we get that name from, Ishmaelites? Doesn't this, from who? Ishmael? Yeah, Ishmael. Where does that come from, Ishmael? Obviously, the Ishmaelites come from Ishmael. Where does Ishmael come from? Where do we know in history?
Hagar.
Yeah, Hagar. And so you've got Abraham ends up, we talked about last week, and I was thinking about it because Julie was sitting right there, and I said, that's not a good, wise decision. When Sarai, before she was Sarah, said, take Hagar. We're supposed to have a kid. I can't have one, so take Hagar, sleep with her, and have a kid. Not a good decision. And so when that happens, he names him Ishmael. Well, this is Abraham's kid. So now all of a sudden he's got a nation that's come from him, just as it was prophesied that he would have a nation. That was going to be the promise that God told him, that he's going to be a nation. Now, it's interesting because as you look at it, it says they're coming across in verse 25. Now, in verse 27, it says, hey, let's sell them to the Ishmaelites. So far, everything seems pretty normal. And then in verse 28, the Mennonite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up, and they lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. So you got the Midianites, and you got the Ishmaelites. And really, the reason why I bring that up is because that can kind of be confusing. Okay, which did he sell him to? Did he sell him to the Midianites, or did he sell him to the Ishmaelites? And when it comes down to it, the answer would be yes. He sells them to both, because both of them are the same people. You have in Genesis 25, verse 2, it talks about one of the, I'll just flip over there right quick. The only reason I bring this up is this doesn't really necessarily have anything to do with the promises, but it's just something that comes up, so I wanted to bring it up. In Genesis 25, verse 2, it talks about Abraham took another wife, Keturah, and she bore him, and then you look at the fourth person, and that's Midian. And so Midian, he ends up having his own group, Midianites. You have Ishmael, and they are in the same region. And so if you looked at Judges 8, and we won't look there, but if you look at Judges 8, they use Midianite and Ishmaelite in the same terms. And so it's really a group of people. You know, in other words, United States citizen, American. We use the same terminology. And so, therefore, it's the same group, they just interchange it. So if you were, the Ishmaelites didn't have a certain region, so if you're there where the Midianites, you'd be a Midianite even though you're an Ishmaelite. So hopefully that makes sense. He sells them off to these people. So going back to Genesis 37, he sells them off. And it says he sells them for 20 shekels of silver. Now, we've talked about in class before that Exodus 21:32 talks about the slave is worth 30 shekels. So if somebody if you got a slave gored, then you would have to pay the owner of the slave 30 shekels of silver. Now, where do we get that 30 shekels of silver, 30 pieces of silver significance? All right, so Jesus was sold for 30 pieces of silver, and so likened to 30 shekels of silver, so this would be the price of a slave. And we've talked about that before, that Jesus was sold out, betrayed for the price of a slave. But now, this is a little bit different. This is 20 shekels of silver. So hold your spot here and look at Leviticus 27, verse 5. So this kind of gives indication of the age of Joseph when we look at this verse. We already know that he's a little bit younger because he's not going out and into the herds and shepherding like the other brothers are. But in Leviticus 27, verse 5, it says, if a person is from 5 years old to 20 years old, the value shall be for the male 20 shekels, and for the female 10 shekels. So this would be for a slave. They're worth 20 shekels of silver, which is the reason why that was a going rate for Joseph. They're going to sell him for 20 shekels of silver, move him on his way. So they get the money, and it's really not a significant amount of money. And so at this point, in verse 36 of Genesis 37, it says the Midianites sold him, or the Ishmaelites sold him to Egypt to Potiphar. We're going to skip chapter 38. We're going to get to that probably next week. There's a significance about 38 that I want to hit, but I don't want to lose the story because it's right there in the middle of Joseph's story. And so at this point, in verse 37, we see some amazing things that how God provides, just like Abraham said. One of the things we talked about last week was that in their culture, they named things after the experiences they had with God, his character. And so you have Abraham supposed to sacrifice his only son, Isaac. And then the angel says, Abraham, and he says, here I am. And he says, don't do it. And then all of a sudden, there's a ram in the thicket that he goes and he uses. And God says, you've proven yourself true. You wouldn't even withhold your only son from me. And so he uses this ram and he makes a sacrifice. And so Abraham names this place, the Lord will provide. So he builds an altar and he calls that the Lord will provide. So anytime they're walking across up in that area, he and Isaac or anybody else, they would have said, that's the Lord will provide. You remember that? Because remember what he did for us. And so instead of naming things after what we do, we name them after people, don't we? You can look at our schools. A.C. Jones is named after a person, and Moreno named after a person. So you look at these different things. We have Washington Street, right? Named after a person. And so looking at that, they name things after the characteristics of God, their experiences they had. Now think if we did that here. Wouldn't that be amazing? Because then you'd have constant reminders of how great God is towards us. When things get really bad and really difficult and you don't understand, how he just simply works it out all the time. This story reminds me, if somebody would like to turn to Romans chapter 8, verse 28, this whole story reminds me of this right here and of this one verse. Because when we have difficult times, and there's no doubt there's going to be difficult times. Edward has brought up about that before that, when people behave badly towards you, because of your faith, then just rejoice. It talks about that in the, when you're persecuted in Matthew 5. Well, now Romans 8:28, it says, and we know that those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who have been called according to his purpose. And we've talked about that a purpose is for you to be saved, and for those who are saved, be more like Jesus. So he's going to work it out. If you're loving him, he's going to work it out for your good. Just like Joseph. Joseph now is a slave. He was born a free man, now he's a slave, and what did he do? What did he do wrong? He didn't do anything. He was just a favorite. You can't help being a favorite. That was his dad's doing. And so we know that he got a coat that was multicolored, that was different than the son's. He got the nice stuff. Well, he can't do anything about that. Now he's sold as a slave. And look at what God does for him in Genesis 39. It reminds us who is with us during tough times. Because in verse 2, who is with Joseph in verse 2? The Lord was, right? It makes it clear what is happening in the success and all these different things that the Lord is with him. Doesn't mean bad things are going to happen, but he's going to turn it for the good. And so the Lord was with Joseph. And he became a successful man and was in the house of the Egyptian master. And the master saw the Lord was with him. And the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. And so Joseph found favor in his sight. And so all these things are going to take place. And at the very end of verse 6, he's a good strapping young man, good looking kid. He becomes a man. And in verse 7, we see that Potiphar's wife decides she wants to be with him in obviously a sexual way. Now, in verse 8, he refuses. Now, what's interesting, she keeps on, and in verse 9, how does he respond? In that last, he brings up a question in the last part of verse 9. What does he say? How can I sin against God? He doesn't say, I'm going to do something bad against Potiphar. He knows who he's sinning against. That's what we should be realizing. It's not about some person that we mess up with. It's about God who told us not to do it. And so he realizes, if I do this, just take Potiphar out of the situation. The one that is protecting me, my God, will know. How could I do this and go against God? How could I rebel against him? And if we get to that point and we understand our relationship, how can I do something bad against God? He's given me everything. even though he's a slave, even though these bad things have happened, that will change our mindset about what we want to do. Instead of our will, it'll be his will. Edward?
I was going to say that, and that's one of the big problems with we people that understand things from the Bible. Because I mean, at work, I've had people come up to me and say, do you think you could put a 6-pack of beer in a brown sack and put it in my car? I don't want somebody to see me get it. They're more worried about us seeing them get it than the one they should be worried about.
Right.
Yeah. That happens all the time.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You got to. I know it happens a lot of time. I've been in there. You got a lot of brown bags. And so in verse 10, this just doesn't happen once. This happens day after day. So it's one thing to overcome a temptation, once. But when it's there in front of your face day after day, it would be so easy because Potiphar's not going to know because she's going to keep it secret just like the brown bag. And so we'll probably bring this up several times. So he, as you know, she grabs his cloak and he takes off running, and he leaves it there because he is fleeing sin. He's getting away, and so he gets accused of rape. And so, are you kidding me? He didn't do any of this, did he? Completely innocent. All he did was be born, and he was the favorite. Now he's sold, and now he's being accused of something he didn't ever do. Ever. And never would even imagine doing this. Because remember, he said, I can't sin against God. I can't do this bad thing. He didn't even go there in his imagination. And so now she goes and she tells her husband, I can't believe, because she's rejected, I can't believe he did this to me. He tried to take advantage of me. And so next thing you know, in verse 20, he's put into prison. And so they're going to be there for a while. But the amazing thing is verse 23. When difficult times come, circumstances that you can't understand why it's happening, you look who was with him. So the keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything in Joseph's charge because who was with him? Yeah, the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. And so no matter where you're at, even in prison, the Lord's going to be with you.
Right.
Yes.
I think something worthy of noting is this. Sometimes you'll hear people are talking about the Lord, and if you're in the Lord, I mean, you're going to be wealthy. You're going to have everything's going to fall in place.
Yeah.
Here the Lord was with him, and it didn't
That's right.
come that way.
Yeah.
But in the end, he stood with the Lord, and the Lord stood with him.
Yeah, he doesn't promise you riches. What he does promise you in Matthew 6 is you don't have to worry about your clothes, what you're going to eat, And so those things, if you seek the kingdom, right? And he references Matthew 6:33. So when we get to it, we have a cupbearer and we have a baker, right? As we know the story, these two guys have dreams. They don't have a clue what the dreams are. And I just think this is kind of an amusing thing. Because in verse 5, they both have dreams. And in verse 9, the cupbearer, he tells Joseph his dream. Says, hey man, what do you think this means? Now I don't know why he pursued Joseph for it, but it seemed like he was probably kind of a leader. And so he's going to go to Joseph, and he says, well, in verse 13, in 3 days, he's going to restore you to office. Man, that's a pretty good dream. He told him something good about it. I think that's why they there for a while they had those 1-800 numbers, and that Jamaican lady, she could tell all these different things. I don't know if y'all remember that or not. I can't even remember what her name was. Yeah, Miss Cleo. Yeah, he called. And so, are my parents going to find out I did this? And so, yeah, Miss Cleo. So you want to call to get something good. So he calls up this guy, Joseph, and Joseph gives him something good. He's really excited. 3 days. I can count that down. It's 72 hours, right? And so, or something like that, 72. And so he gets excited about it. So then you've got the baker. And in verse 14, though, he says, only remember me. That's all I want from this. Just remember me when you get restored. And so in verse 16, you got the chief baker. Now, he's thinking, man, oh, he got some good news. I'm going to get some good news. And so, as we know in verse 19, it really wasn't good news. Because in 3 days, he will lift your head from you. In other words, you're going to die. He's going to hang you on a tree, and birds will eat the flesh from you. Well, it'd have been better if he had never asked. Then to be thinking 3 days. That's a long time to be thinking about your death. And so sure enough, in verse 21 and 22, it happens just as he says. But sometimes when good things happen, you forget to thank people. And he forgets Joseph. How many times have you had people praying for you? God answers your prayer. Sometimes you don't even thank God for it. And you forget to thank the people that have been praying. And let them know, because they don't even know the outcome. They're just wondering what happened. And you've been praying for them. And so, that's something that we need to remember. Joseph is forgotten here. And he'd like to be remembered because he's in a place he'd like not to be anymore. And so in chapter 41, verse 1, how many years is that? 2 years. 2 full years. We don't know how much it was before, but now we've got 2 more years added to his imprisonment for doing what? Nothing wrong. You see people on TV and they're always saying they're innocent. The people I work with, a lot of them say they're innocent too. This man was innocent. He actually didn't do anything wrong. Lisa knows all about that. I didn't do anything. And so then, all of a sudden, in verse 3 of chapter 41, and in verse 5, Pharaoh has some dreams. He doesn't understand. And he's like, man, I've got this and this, these sheaves are eating these, and then these ugly cows are eating the big plump ones, and I don't understand any of it. So he starts asking around, and just so happens the cupbearer remembers Joseph. He tells him about him, and so he goes and he says, well, can you tell dreams? He says, no, I can't do that, but if God gives me favor to do it, I can. So here's a man who understands where the good things come from, where the blessings come from. He hasn't forgotten God in this. You don't see one thing of bitterness in his story whatsoever. He's not bitter the whole time. And why would that be? What does he understand that other people may not?
God's been with him the whole time.
God's always with him. God's protecting him and God's guiding him. And there's a purpose behind all this. And sometimes we don't see the purpose. But Romans chapter 8, verse 28 says God works out all things according to his purpose, right? So this is part of that purpose. And so, I remember, different people in the job, well, couple jobs that I had previously, of people saying stuff. And I'm like, how do you even make up stuff like that? And every once in a while, you'd hear some different things, different stories. And then every once in a while, they'd say something about you. And I remember on 3 different occasions, but on the previous jobs I had, people lying about me. I'm like, what are you doing? Well, I don't understand this. I remember one kid said, started passing the word that she didn't like the way I touched her. I'm like, oh, no, that's not me. I'm not doing that. That's one thing. The door's always open around me. Even when I'm studying with ladies here in town, I'm studying in a public place. I said, so, I was pretty aggravated. You can only imagine. And so I'm hearing about this news, and a kid came up and told me about it. Said, Mr. Todd, I just wanted to tell you that so-and-so says you touched her. And I know that wouldn't be the case, but I wanted you to be aware. And I don't know if she could see, but on the outside, what I felt on the inside, because I would have just been red, just anger. And so I go and talk to my boss, say, hey, what's going on? Do you know anything about this? I need to come and bring it to your attention because this is obviously something to being accused of. After they did all the digging and after everything was said, it was, I'm going to touch you the way she told me I touched her. He said, well, yeah, this administrator found her and everything. He said, yeah, well, I heard Mr. Todd's touching you in a way that's inappropriate and that you don't like. And can you kind of tell me where he's touching you? And she says, oh, yeah, he does this. He pats me 2 times on the shoulder. Are you kidding me? Man, I was pretty aggravated because then that permeated through the whole school. Are you kidding me? And then there was another situation where I got a deal where there was and this went on for 2 years. There was a girl that said that I touched her because she came to school under the influence. And so, it was obvious. I mean, you walk in, you just smell the marijuana, and she, look, what are you talking about? And she, her blood pressure, everything indicated. Her eyes are dilated, everything. And I had to go and search her. And so I've got the nurse in there once again, right? Not by myself. Got the nurse searching. And all of a sudden, she tells her mom that I touched her. I'm like, how is this possible? I even had a witness saying I wasn't, I didn't do it. And so through that, oh, and by the way, about the patting, I pat everybody twice. It's just kind of, hey, I quit doing that. And so you should have seen at graduation when that girl was coming through, I was patting everybody. And I just gave her a little fist bump, move on, But with this lady, the mom calls up and says she's going to get a lawyer. She's going to get all these people because I touched her daughter. I'm thinking, I didn't. And so 2 years later, she finally wants to come back to my school. And I'm like, you know what? She can't come back to my school accusing me. And so we sit down. After she's accused me and multiple other people, she's going to get a lawyer and all this stuff. She had never done it. So I think she was just blowing smoke. But still, you're being accused. And she was telling everybody freely what I had done. And so we get there. And sure enough, the girl tells the story. She says, well, everybody's sitting there and I'm just fuming. She says, well, we're just going to, we're going to hear from her, the accused, or the person that's the victim. And so, I'm sitting there listening with all these other people and I'm just thinking, man, it's just my name. It's just my name. It's all I've worked for, just my name. And so she goes in there and she says, well, and she had a hoodie on at the time and that's all she had underneath it. She didn't have an undershirt like I have. And so I was like, oh, well, no, don't take that off. Don't take that off. I just need to see what's in here. And I grabbed the pocket and I just did like that. I said, I just need to see what's in there. So put your hand through it. So she puts her hand through it and there wasn't anything there. And that was it. She told that story in that group. And that mom said, what? That's what he did? Well, he didn't touch you. And then she starts after her. And I'm thinking, why didn't you guys talk 2 years ago, about this? And so now I'm off the hook, but I'm just thinking, you guys lied and I ended up getting hurt over the deal. And so here's what's going on with him. He's got lied about, so he's been in jail the whole time, in prison. And so as this goes on, now, my goodness. So he finally gets out because he tells him what's going to happen. He says, there's going to be 7 good years where you're going to be blessed with crops. And then 7 bad years, it's going to be a famine, and it's going to be really bad. And so he told him, he said, kind of gives him the plan of what he needs to do. Now, what happens in verse 40, he says, you shall be over my house, chapter 41, verse 40. You shall be over my house, all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards to the throne will I be greater than you. Wow. It's pretty impressive. There's a guy named Peter that I know. He's from Africa. And it's one of the countries there just north of South Africa. And he goes to America. He gets his education. He ended up getting his PhD, I think. And all of a sudden he goes back to his home country. And he's a Secretary of Agriculture. And I just think about him because he grew up poor. And he was a guy that was hanging around some missionaries. They always would tell him, hey, go get some firewood and stuff. And he kept hanging around them. Eventually, he learns the gospel. And he becomes a Christian. And they send him over to America to get trained. And now he is the most important person in that country because he's a Secretary of Agriculture in an area that always has problems with food issues and shortages. So I think of him, Peter, when I think of this story. And so he gets elevated. And the interesting thing is now verse 46. How old is he now? 30 years old, right? That's been a lot of difficulty to get to that. Since he was a young man, all the way to this time. And you don't hear one bitterness. He doesn't talk about being bitter. You don't hear any of that. Because he seems like he still has the faith of a young person. You know what the faith of a young person is, right? Oh yeah, you bet. God will take care of it. They've got such tremendous faith in God. They're like, oh yeah, God will take care of my needs. No big deal. And that seems as though he has that kind of faith. That there's nothing my God cannot do. And so, as it goes on, it says in verse 57, moreover, the whole earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain because the famine was so severe over the whole earth. Now, historians talk about this time period that before this, it was a very average nation. And all of a sudden, they're going to be rising to prominence and be a world power because everybody's going to sell them stuff. Everybody's going to sell everything off. They're going to sell their land. They're going to sell their livestock. And then they're eventually going to sell themselves. And so Egypt is going to become a dominating figure because of this famine. The reason why that's interesting is because that's part of the purpose. So then you see that in chapter 42, Joseph's family is going to have problems where they're at. And they're going to want to come, right? And so they're going to come and they're going to get it checked out. And there's going to be a back and forth multiple times of trying to get this taken care of. And eventually, he's going to reveal himself. And look at chapter 45. And obviously, if you're not too familiar with the details or you don't recall them all, read those chapters. It's amazing how God is in every single one of these situations that Joseph's going through. He goes up. He finally reveals himself to his family. And in verse 3, he says, and Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is your father still alive? But his brothers could not answer, for they were dismayed at his presence. Remember, they had told the dad that, hey, something killed him when they had really sold him. And he said, so he told them in verse 4, hey, come near me. I'm your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. Now think about that. Basically, he's saying, I remembered everything that you did. Now, can you imagine if you'd have been the brothers? I mean, wow. But then he says, do not be distressed or angry with yourselves. Because I'm sure there's probably, he's the one that wanted to, blaming each other. But he said, don't be upset or angry at yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. It was all part of that plan. God works out everything according to his purpose. And it says the famine has been these 2 years, and there are 5 years in which there'll be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve you a remnant on earth. Remember, we got to get to the blessing. We got to get to the nation. We got to get to them having a land. Because that was the promise that Abraham got. You're going to be a nation. I'm going to give you a land. And through you, all nations will be blessed. Talking about through Jesus, through that lineage. And so then he says, this was so there'd be a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. So right there, he's talking without saying it all. He's saying, I'm keeping the promise alive. God's using me to bless everybody. Now, what a perspective. Because a lot of times we look at it and we think, are you kidding me? What lesson can we learn? Well, I can't trust that person, or I'm not going to do this again, But he's likening it to understanding God's in control of this whole thing. That is amazing because he goes down and he goes and gets them. Now, they're going to end up going to Goshen. That's where they're going to be living. And what's amazing is the Egyptians, as you read on, and for lack of time, the Egyptians think that sheep herders are detestable. So they're just going to keep them over here in Goshen. And Goshen's the best place. That's a great area. So they're going to leave them there. And so you have 70 of his family come up and they stay in Goshen. And they're just going to be able to stay there without being harmed or messed with by the Egyptians. And they're going to grow. And they're going to grow and they're going to grow. And so God knows exactly what he's doing. Look in chapter 46, verse 26. And this is where I get the 70 number. And all the persons belonging to Jacob who came to Egypt, who were his own descendants, not including Jacob's sons' wives, were 66 persons in all. And the sons of Joseph, who were born into Egypt, were 2. All the persons of Jacob's house who came into Egypt were 70. So that from there is going to explode. We haven't got to the nation yet, but it's happening. And it talks about in verse 34 that they thought that sheep herders were, it talks in my mind, an abomination to the Egyptians. So they were detestable. And then when it goes, as it continues on, we see that the Pharaoh blesses him, blesses these people. And then it says, eventually we have Jacob dying. And so he says in chapter 47, verse 30, I'm going to lie with my fathers, carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burying place. And so then we see Joseph, he says, or Jacob tells Joseph in chapter 48, verse 4, he says, behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you, and I'll make you a company of many peoples and give you this land to your offspring after you for an everlasting possession. So he tells him that God appeared to me in the land of Canaan and told me this. And we know that from verse 3. And so he's telling about this promise that keeps on coming up. Now, the promise hasn't been fulfilled yet. It's been 3 generations. Now we're about to be on the 4th generation. It still hasn't come true. God sometimes takes his time instead of our time for things to happen. And so at this point, look in chapter 49, because in chapter 49, Reuben is supposed to get everything. He's supposed to get the blessing. He's the firstborn. But Reuben, it says that he went up in verse 4, went up to your father's bed, and you defiled it. In other words, you were sleeping with people you shouldn't be sleeping with. So you're not going to get the firstborn blessing. He goes to verse 5, Simeon and Levi, you went in and you killed other people. And so you're not going to get it. So then, verse 8, this is where we get to Judah. And he says, from Judah, this is the promise. He gets the promises of the blessing. And in verse 10, it says, the scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet. And so at this point, this is where you're going to have the line of kings come from. This is where this is going to be the lineage of Jesus. He's going to be coming from Judah because of this right here. And so at this point, he dies and they weep 70 days in chapter 50, verse 3. And that would be unheard of for someone who's not an Egyptian. And so that just tells you how much respect they have for Joseph, a slave, a man who is accused of rape. And now he's elevated to the second highest, a man who is innocent. And so in chapter 50, verse 7, they bury his dead. But when this happens, now the brothers have to be more fearful as ever because now dad's gone. But in verse 18, we still don't see any bitterness. And in verse 18, it says, his brothers also came. And what do they do in verse 18? They fell down. They bowed down, didn't they? That's very similar to the 2 dreams that he had about the sheaves bowing down, about the stars bowing and the sun and the moon bowing to him. All of a sudden, we see it being fulfilled here. And God sometimes takes a while to fulfill it. And so then he says, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? In verse 20, as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear, I will provide for you and your little ones. And he comforted them, spoke kindly to them. No bitterness, because he knew who was in charge. When you think about the toughest things that you go through in life, they may be things that are going to be taking place. It may be things that you're in right now experiencing, or maybe things in the past. God is fully in charge because he knows all that's going on. He just tells you to do one thing. You love me. You keep my commands because I guarantee I'm going to work out everything for your good according to his purpose. And sometimes I think that's where we fall into because we're thinking, well, this should be the purpose. And well, no. Because there's going to be a lot of people learn some things off what they see you and how you live. And in spite of all the things that are going on, they're going to see how you carry yourself during these times. Joseph was a guy that carried himself in such a way, was just respectful the whole way, even though he didn't do anything wrong. And God's got a way of working it all out. And then what's amazing here is verse 24, because Joseph understands the promise that was given. And he says, I'm about to die, but God will visit you. Now he's foreseeing this. He's saying God will visit you and he'll bring you out of the land to this land, or to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. He's talking about that land promise. He's about to die and he's saying, I'm not ever going to see it. This was my land. This was the here I was supposed to be in this place right here for right now. But your ancestors are going to see this land. And I want you, he says, then Joseph made his sons swear. Sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry my bones from here. He's already understanding that I won't see it. I'm about to die. But at some point, you guys are going to get the land. So when he says the sons of Israel, he's talking about the nation of Israel. He's saying, I want you to promise that you're going to carry my bones out of this place. Because this is not home. And we should have that same understanding. This isn't home. You may be burying me at the cemetery here in Beeville, but this isn't home. We've got another home. And that's what we should be focused on, because God's going to work out everything for our good according to his purpose if we just focus on him and what's most important for him. Now, that is the class, I believe. And so I didn't hear it ring, and so I'm going to assume that they're stressed out in there thinking, I hope it rings soon. But we will pick up there, and we're going to start in Exodus next, as we see how God continues to use people. And if he could use them then, he can still use us to affect and impact the lives of others.